Boom, and we're in. Welcome to a trophy cabinet day in the Good Listening to show clearing. This is Andy Coulson, who I'm going to be contextualizing shortly. I'm sure many of us know exactly who he is, and I'm Chris Grimes. I'm the host. I'm just going to press a button on go live for Instagram, which is now behaving. Boom. That gives us a slight false start I described, but now we're in. So I'm going to go live again in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Boom. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a trophy cabinet day in the Good Listening to show, Stories of Distinction and Genius. Delighted to welcome Andy Coulson to the show. Andy, as I'm sure many of us will know, is a journalist and political strategist, founder of Coulson Partners, that I'll talk about later on as well, former Downing Street Director of Communications for David Cameron, circa 2010, former News of the World editor too. Why I wanted to speak to you, Andy, apart from the joy and the privilege of curating you through this structure and journey, is I saw you speak at the Entrepreneurs Convention a few months ago. And when you came on stage, I thought it'd be really, really fascinating to try and curate you through this journey. And when I listened to you, I was so struck. It made me think of Dickens, you know, the best of times, the worst of times, and the sort of throne rooms of power in a sort of Shakespearean context. I thought, gosh, what a fantastic story that you've had. We'll contextualize everything as we go along. But first of all, welcome to the show. How's morale and what's your story of the day, Andy Coulson?
Oh, well, it's great to be with you, Chris. Thanks for inviting me on, and thanks for that very generous intro. It's interesting that you mentioned Dickens. I'm a big Dickens fan. Perhaps we'll talk about it later, but Dickens was quite important to me at a certain point of my life.
Yes.
So maybe we'll pick up on that later.
And
but no, all is well here with me, and I'm very pleased to be spending a bit of time with you.
Lovely. And I've got a very exciting section towards the end, which is show us your QR code, please. So I'll obviously be pointing people to your own podcast, Crisis, What Crisis, and also to Coulson Partners as well. So yes, what I was so struck with was the sort of, the extraordinary experience of, you described 1 minute in a truncated timeline being in a helicopter sandwiched between David Cameron and Obama back in the day. And then again, truncating the timeline. Then the helicopter does a bit of a hard landing. And then again, it's a truncated timeline. You find yourself, best of times, worst of times, in a prison cell. So you've had many, many sliding doors, as you described, of your own volition in your life. So for those of us that don't have a sort of reference point to how you describe, what do you do then? What's your favorite way of avoiding or answering that question, Andy, about yourself? So what does
I don't avoid it, and that goes to a central sort of part of my approach, what my sort of belief system, if you want to be a little bit more, kind of airy-fairy about it. I'm not for avoiding the past. I'm not for avoiding failures, and I've had plenty of them. I am for embracing them, putting them to work, but not being defined by them. And that's what I've been busy doing since 2016, really, when my dramas, which had lasted for the previous 5 years, came to an end. And since then, I've been working pretty hard, not at reinventing myself, because I'm not one for reinvention. I am one for taking your failures and putting them to work and moving forward. I kind of think that's the point of being here, if I can put it that way. And so yeah, in some regards, we've done that pretty successfully. The business is in good shape, where I absolutely put my experience, the good and the bad, to good use as a strategic advisor. We do that in and around crisis, but we also do it in other areas that are less sharp, if you like.
Yes.
And I also put it to work with my podcast. That's what the pod is all about, really. My podcast, I'm a big fan of yours, but my podcast is is a place where I can sort of shoot some arrows back out into the world that I hope are useful. It's all there for everybody, free, and I get so much from it. So it's it's done with that sort of idea in mind, but it's also incredibly helpful for me, frankly.
Yes.
When I sit down once a fortnight with someone who's been through a difficult time, invariably far in excess of what I went through, it gives me a fresh dose of perspective. It gives me a fresh dose of gratitude. It gives me a fresh dose of resilience. It's just, there's the listener can make up, or the viewer can make up their own minds, but I find it helpful. That's for
Another
sure.
main hook when I heard you speaking was you said that humour is the most underrated resilience strategy. And because I work as a motivational comedian, and I similarly find podcasting incredibly cathartic for what I learned from my guests as well. So I'm completely in that arena with you as well. And of course, Crisis, What Crisis, your podcast is very beautifully, succinctly put, lessons for when life unravels. And again, I was so struck that obviously in a sporting analogy, you're like a player manager because you absolutely know what it's like to hit, the heights and also rock bottom, which is a sort of fascinating, journey to now, a bit like you've prepared your entire life for this moment.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it does draw on, I suppose, various parts of my working life. It certainly draws on my time as a journalist. This is before I was an editor. When I was a reporter, I was a showbiz reporter as a young man. So I spent my life, my 20s really, flying around the world, turning left on aeroplanes and interviewing very famous people. It was an amazing way to spend your 20s. And a lot of those interviews were with very famous people wanting to sit down and share their stories. And so in a way, that's what I'm doing now. The difference now is that there's no agenda. I'm not pursuing the story. This isn't, it's a very different enterprise and exercise. Yes. And I think because of what's happened to me in the interim, both in terms of the jobs that I've done as an advisor, that I think has definitely sort of adjusted my view of storytelling for sure. But also, of course, my own difficulties mean that my conversations are certainly different to what they were when I was in my 20s, and that's lovely. I really, I find that very satisfying because it's a sort of, if it's not for anyone else, it proves to me that that I've learned a bit along the way and I've changed a bit along the way, and as a result, I think we end up with a pretty rich conversation, and also I think some guests know that so obviously I'm super transparent about the fact that I went to prison for a while, and I've interviewed a number of people who've also been to prison, but most of our guests have not. I think we just sort of get to the point of trust pretty quickly, and that obviously makes for a very good conversation.
And I love the description of yourself, of the fact you feel that you've been a poacher, a gamekeeper, and also game, as in fair game, in the narrative. And again, to the sliding doors of your life that you've turned into an extraordinarily powerful way of helping others when their life unravels. And that, of course, is what Coulson Partners are about too.
Yes, exactly. That's what we're all about, really. Particularly for people who've, as I say, have been through or are going through difficulty, but also for people, we work with corporates, we work with private offices, family offices, we work with individuals. More often than not, actually, it's an unrealized opportunity. It's a bit of a frustration that they haven't got the reputation that they need to drive their purpose. And that's what we do, really. We're not PRs in the sort of traditional sense. There are plenty of brilliant PR firms out there, but we're not about fame. We are about providing our clients with exactly the reputation they need to drive their purpose. It's got to be purpose-led. It can't be about profile and fame in that sense for us and the kind of work that we do. And of course, if crisis comes, then that is obviously a risk to your reputation. Then it's a risk to your values. It's a risk to every fundamental in your life. And we know what that feels like. I know what that feels like, and so we're pretty good people to have in the room.
So it's a very cathartic space you have curated, and I congratulate you for that, and using all the previous life experience, bringing to bear, joining the dots up backwards in order to play towards your future.
Yeah, well, thanks, Chris. Yeah, I mean, I had a choice when I sort of emerged from my difficulties in 2015. The two choices for me were, and obviously I was pretty unemployable, bluntly. I've been, comprehensively cancelled is the word that we would use now, and I didn't have a queue of people lining up to employ me, I can tell you. But I did have an offer to write a book, and to sort of tell my stories, to go out, and write that kind of book, kick a few shins, tell my stories. And I'm not going to lie to you, I certainly thought about it because I didn't have too many other options, and I got a young family to take care of. I didn't quite know what was going to happen next, but I thought hard about it. And actually, what I always wanted to do, this is when I was in Downing Street, my plan was always to see whether or not I could build a business, because I'd only ever been an employee in my life, and the people that I really admire are people who get out and build something for themselves. And I thought, well, that's what I'm going to do when I step out of politics. But of course, things took a turn, and then I reached that point where I thought, actually, this is going to be difficult. This is probably the more difficult choice. But I don't want to be that bloke who writes that kind of book and who tours the TV studios and who kind of, becomes even more bloody notorious, and who's just, trying to cash in or leverage the mistakes that he's made in that kind of way, rather than acknowledging that I'd made some pretty epic errors in my professional life, but that I've also had some great success in my professional life. So I'm going to put both of those two things to work. And I'm going to call this business Coulson Partners. I'm going to put my name over the door so everyone knows who it is and what I am, and it's all there, inescapable anyway on Google. There's no getting away from it, and I didn't even try. And that's what I mean about reinvention, really. I think the book would have required some kind of attempt at reinvention, and it wouldn't have been me. I would have hated it. I know I would have hated it. And so I took the other path. Established a business, and then with the help of a lot of other people along the way, not least my brilliant clients, we've got ourselves into a very good position, and we have a wonderful business now.
And full transparency and full disclosure is what you're applying as a currency, and I think that's something that's incredibly rich and precious, and therefore people can learn and get perspective from it.
Yeah, I think so. That's my view of the world. Listen, there've been some pretty successful reinventions. I think we've just seen a pretty, we're talking the day after Donald Trump was inaugurated. So, there are other routes one can take.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way. But I think there's on that example, I think it would be a very dangerous thing to look at the success or the comeback of Donald Trump and see that as a lesson for life. I think it's an extraordinary set of circumstances, and I think he is an extraordinary human being in the true sense of the word extraordinary.
Yes.
And I think to think that the methods that he's deployed are the methods one should deploy to reach a happy life.
Yes.
Or a meaningful life,
it's the pursuit of happiness is the human condition, of course.
I'm not so sure that is. I'm sure there'll be plenty of people listening to us screaming in disagreement. I don't know, but that's not for me anyway. That's not the route for me. The route for me was to kind of lean into the failures that I've had in my life, acknowledge them. Also, when I get the opportunity to apologize for them, this is another one of those opportunities. I don't know who's listening to this or watching this podcast, but it may well be someone who is affected by what happened at the News of the World. And so I'll always apologize for the mistakes I made. I don't think I broke the law, I should say. But I certainly messed up as the editor of that newspaper pretty epically. But also to say that, I'm not going to apologize for trying to make my life as productive as it can be now, and that's what I'm working very hard at doing. And that's really the kind of the sort of thread that now runs through my life, is just trying to be as productive as possible.
And indeed, the conference I saw you speak at, the Entrepreneurs Convention, it was about one word, and it was about persistence. And that was what was fascinating also about your time on the stage, was the fact that, we need to persist in order to, reinvent the narrative to pull ourselves towards our future. Yeah.
Again, I'm not a fan of the word reinvention, because reinvention suggests to me a sort of an erasing of the past, and I'm not for that. But yes, certainly. For me, it is, the word persistence is wholly appropriate and useful. the more important word that sits in my mind every day really is productivity.
Mhm.
That's the am I being productive? On the moments when I'm beating myself up, it's because I feel I haven't been productive enough. And I do that sort of audit on myself on a fairly regular basis, possibly too often. But I don't know. But yeah, that's the kind of internal commentary for me, my operating system, which is a question I ask, if you'll forgive me, on my podcast pretty frequently, because I'm very interested in people's operating systems. If I turn that question on myself, then that's the dial that I'm always looking to turn up. Am I getting more out of this situation, day, hour, minute, year?
So let's get you on the open road of the curated structure of the Good Listening To show. It's going to be a clearing a tree, a lovely juicy storytelling exercise called 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. There's going to be some alchemy, some gold, a couple of random squirrels, a cheeky bit of Shakespeare, a golden baton, and a cake. Also, your wonderful, the person that works for you within Crisis What Crisis, Jane Sankey, was really wonderful at helping me ask you the question of whether you'd like to be in it. So I remember a phone call where I rang up and was talking about random squirrels, and she went, "This is interesting. I'll ask Andy and see what he thinks." So I sincerely hope that
you had her at Squirrel.
Yes, you had me at Squirrel. So we're going to get to your squirrels. So let's get going. So Andy Coulson, where is a clearing for you? Where do you go to get clutter-free, inspirational, and able to think?
Well, I suspect, like a lot of your guests, it's home for me. And there's a period in my life where I was removed from my home for a period when I was sent to prison, and so my appreciation of that environment was then and is now pretty heightened. I had a conversation recently with Paul McKenna, the hypnotherapist, on my podcast, and we were talking about manifestation, and I was getting him to chat through the process. He's just written a book on manifesting, and as he was talking, I was thinking to myself, I'm not sure I've ever really manifested. But then it occurred to me that I did, because when I was in prison, I would often, as you'd find yourself in prison with too much time on your hands, I would often just think about being at home, sat in front of the fire, my family around me, my dog at my feet, maybe a glass of wine, and I would think very, very hard about that, and I was manifesting. I was definitely sort of in his definition of it. I was manifesting. Now, whether or not that actually helped me to get through and then eventually, get to that point where I stepped through the door and was able to do that, and I remember that day very well when I did. I don't really know, but I know that my default clearing is for sure, that place. Sat with my family. I've got 3 sons, and with my wife Eloise. Sadly, the dog that was in my mind at that time, we lost him a little while later. But we have another. Ferdinand is an important part of our lives.
That's a really beautiful manifestation of a serious happy place. You're clearing, home is where the heart is, and to have imagined that from the moment of despair behind the bars to then pull you through is a really unique. No one's ever interpreted it with that answer. So we're going to be in front of the fire. Shay, household Coulson. You can have the dog, the family, the wine. It's all there. That's your clearing. That's your serious happy place. I'm now going to interfere, if I may, and interrupt your clearing by arriving with a tree. And because of my acting background, this is a bit Waiting for Godot-esque, a bit Beckett-y, a bit deliberately existential. I'm going to shake your tree to see which storytelling apples fall out. How do you like these apples? And this is where you've been kind enough to have thought about, you've had 5 minutes to have thought about 4 things that have shaped you, Andy Coulson, 3 things that inspire you, 2 things that never fail to grab your attention, and borrow from the film Up. That's squirrels, what never fails to grab your attention, irrespective of anything else that's going on for you, sometimes called shiny object syndrome. And then the one is a quirky, unusual fact about you we couldn't possibly know about you until you tell us. It's not a memory test, so I'll curate you gently through that. So back to shaking the canopy of your tree as you see fit, and you can go as deep as you like, when you like, how you like, if you like, through this structure. So 4 things, first of all, that have shaped you, Andy Coulson.
Well, I think again, I hesitate because I suspect you've had similar answers, but as with everyone, what shaped me is my my upbringing. I think that's what gave me my work ethic. I think that's what gave me that productivity drive that I have, and I think actually that's what gave me, or at least kind of fueled or enabled my resilience. And I have a fair dose of that, I think. And if I track that back, I think I get that from my mum for sure. Who's a very resilient individual. She's had some very tough stuff in her life, and I think I don't know how much of it is biography versus biology. I think it's probably a bit of both, and I think that's the case. I certainly think that's the case for me. And then I think about, when I think about my upbringing, I don't just think about my family in the immediate environment, because there's some tough stuff as well. I mean, a lot of other people go through, but my parents divorced when I was about 11. It's not a good age for a divorce.
Are they both still with us, your mum and dad?
Yes, they're both still with us. Yeah, in fact, I'll soon be celebrating my father's 90th birthday. He's in very good nick, and my mum too. And they're friendly, and it's all been very civilized over the years, but certainly the divorce had an impact on me, I think, and I think also added to my resilience. I was having to deal with stuff as a sort of an 11-year-old boy that I think actually was pretty tough at the time, but I took the resilience from it for sure, which is a positive. But then it's not just about family; it's about the other people that kind of are around your life as a young person. And when I was 16 years old, I decided I was going to go in the Air Force because my dad was in the Air Force and my oldest brother was in the Air Force, and my plan was to try and be the first member of my family to get a commission. And I was an air cadet. I loved it all, and I was on track to do that actually. And then I did some work experience on the local paper, on the Evening Echo in Basildon. And I met a guy called Peter Owen, who was the deputy editor of that paper, and he became a bit of a mentor of mine. And I wanted to go to work as soon as I finished my O levels, as they were. I wanted to go to work when I was 16, and he wouldn't let me, and he made me go and do my A levels, which I really didn't want to do, but I did that, and he did it with the promise that if I did well in my A levels, then he'd give me an interview and give me a chance of getting on the training scheme to become a journalist, and that's exactly what he did. 2 years later, I got a job with the Evening Echo. I went on their training scheme for 6 months and then became an indentured journalist.
He delivered on his promise of
He delivered on his promise. And
just say his name once again.
Peter Owen, no longer with us, sadly.
Okay. That was my next question.
Unfortunately, very, very well attended funeral down in Billericay, where he lived and was a proper pillar of the community. Peter sort of set me on a path, really. And then from there, I got shifts up into the national newspapers, and from there, my sort of journalistic career took off. So that's where I'd start. I think I'd wrap all that up, if you'll allow me, into kind of upbringing and influences early in my life. My wife and family have shaped me. I've learned so much from them, still do. And then from me a bit as well, I hope. Eloise is my wife's an amazing woman. She just recently started a business. She's an acupuncturist after 3 years of training. She's doing brilliantly with that. She's our sort of family Yoda, which is more complimentary than perhaps it first sounds.
No, I would take it for her as a compliment.
Yeah, no, I will often say, right, you are. I'm very, very lucky. I married brilliantly. Without doubt, the best question I have ever asked anybody was asked of Eloise when I said, "Will you marry me?" Without doubt, my best moment. And then 3 cracking kids. We've got 3 sons. So they shaped me. I learned from them. They're amazing.
And if I may, back to the Dickens quote, the best of times, the worst of times, it was the best question you ever asked, but also it was the highs, the lows for the highs, the nature of a relationship that has all its challenges. And to be a constant in that through life's challenges, adversities, hurdles is a wonderful thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, it's been an amazing and at times difficult, largely due to me, marriage. But it's, I mean, she's an amazing individual. So I'm incredibly lucky. I think I would, if you'll allow me, give a brief mention to, my clients, because they have shaped me. I was trying to think whether or not there's a sort of equivalent in earlier parts of my life, and I think there are. I mean, colleagues really, in the various jobs that I've held, influence you, kind of hugely. And I've worked with some brilliant people over the years. I've been so lucky in so many different environments, newspapers included. One of the sort of, I was gonna say great shames. I don't know whether that's the way to describe it, but one of the great shames for me is at the time of my time in newspapers. Now been so characterized in a certain way, and with good reason to an extent. So this is not a whinge. I'd be the last person to whinge about it. I think it'd be grossly hypocritical. So I'm not doing that. But the difficulties of newspapers, and I was a Sun man more than I was a News of the World man for most of my career. But in both places, were full of very bright, very funny, very hard-working, decent people. And you can have your view on the tabloid press, which I think is perhaps a separate discussion as to the whys and wherefores of it. But they were brilliant places in lots of ways. They're very meritocratic. I'm a lad from born in a council house in Essex. My parents worked very hard to get out of that council house. I took the journey that I briefly described through local newspapers, and then I ended up as a national newspaper editor. And not at any point in that journey did anyone ever say to me, "Where did you go to school, Sunshine?"
Yeah.
They wanted to know whether or not I could do the job and whether I was up to it.
Yeah.
And people can take a view as to whether I was or I wasn't, ultimately. But I had an amazing career in newspapers, surrounded by amazing people. And then in politics, I was plunged into an entirely different world, with some truly brilliant people. And again, the world of politics gets characterized in a certain way. Again, with some justification, I would say, but it's also full of some brilliant people who frankly could, spend their time, effort doing other things that would be with a considerably greater reward. Some truly big brains that I worked around, that I learned from, and I was able to help as well. I contributed for sure. That was a brilliant environment. So if you'll allow me, I'll wrap all that up again together with clients and colleagues.
And which of those parts of your narrative would you describe as your halcyon days? When were you at your happiest in the...
Oh, I'm at my happiest now, for sure.
Good answer. Yeah.
For sure, without any shadow of a doubt. I'm happier in every regard now than I've ever been in my life. And that's a good thing to be able to say at 57. So, but that doesn't mean that there weren't some great moments, and there were, some great moments. There were also some, pretty useless ones, which brings me to my final thing that shaped me, and that would be my failures. And I've had plenty, pretty public, played out in a way that was, difficult to handle at the time. Again, not whinging about it. That would also be hypocritical. But pretty difficult. And the most difficult bit of it was just it was so long and difficult to manage and difficult really to know how you could deal with it. And I took about a year. I think my troubles were sort of 5 years in, across the whole piece. The first year, I sort of slightly lost my head. Didn't really know how to deal with it. So much incoming. My career sort of folded very quickly. When that happens, all the parts of your life that you have built, crumble pretty quickly. Al certainly did. I was unemployable, as I mentioned earlier, pretty quickly. and then just thrown into a long, very long legal process that I didn't really know where it was going to end, and it was multifaceted as well. And that ended eventually in 2014 with a conviction. I was on trial for three charges, and I sort of won two, lost one.
Yeah,
very significant one, and that's when I went to prison. But when I was in prison, I knew that I would be coming out and going straight into another trial, because there was another matter in Scotland which was very, in my view, politically motivated. This is all around the time of the independence, Scottish independence vote, and other factors. But fortunately, so I did come out of prison. I did go straight into another trial, the consequences of which would have been pretty serious had it gone wrong. But I was acquitted in that trial, thankfully, and quite rightly. And that's the point at which I could start to think about the future. And my first thought was, well, what are you going to do about these failures? And as I touched on earlier, my view was, well, I'm not going to try and escape them. I'm not going to try and put them in a box. I'm not going to move abroad or create a business with some mysterious name. I'm not going to try and operate in the shadows. I'm not going to write that book and then follow that route of becoming notorious, as I touched on. What I'm going to do is be me.
Yes.
Right, I'm going to be me, and it will either work or it won't work. And fortunately, it's worked.
It reminds me of that Oscar Wilde quote: "Be yourself, because everyone else is taken." And the true source of resilience, in order to be a phoenix and rise again, is to tap into your own resolve and persistence and tenacity.
I think so. Yeah. And I had time, and although I was very aware of my failures, I was also aware that what we don't do in our prisons, thankfully, is sort of lobotomize. So I still have the same brain. I still think the same way. I still have the same abilities, and I've been in some quite interesting rooms helping people through some quite interesting things and advising along the way. And none of that had been taken from me, those abilities. What had been taken from me was the sort of ability to put it to work.
Yeah.
And so I had to remake that. And it wasn't the easiest of tasks. It was a challenge, sitting down for the first time, trying to convince someone that they need you in their life as an advisor.
Yes.
Was not a straightforward process. But I believed, fundamentally, I believed in my abilities. I believed that I had something useful to contribute, and I believe, and still believe, that if you've got someone in the room who's lived a bit, who's got some scars, who knows what it is to lose a reputation, which is obviously the area that I work in, then that can be very useful.
And that was to my point about being a bit of a player manager. I know it's a slightly fatuous analogy, but the idea that you've been there, you've done it, you've got the T-shirt, you've experienced it, therefore that's seen as a valuable commodity because you've hit rock bottom and you've lived to tell the tale.
Yeah, and then, but as ever, in any profession, the proof is in the work that you deliver. The reason we've been successful is not just because I've been able to sit in front of enough people and say, "Oh, by the way, I think I can put all this failure to work for you." The reason we've been successful is because the work that we produce is pretty good and pretty useful.
Yeah.
And that we make some promises in our business, and promises that I have in my working life, that I'll always have a view, which might sound a bit strange for an advisor, but there are lots of advisors out there who don't necessarily have a view when it matters. That I'll be available, which is very important, particularly for people who are going through difficulty, and that I'll be right more than I'm wrong. So I don't promise that I'll be right all the time, because how can I be? I'm a human being, but I will be right more than I'm wrong. I'm very, very confident that I'll be able to deliver that. And that's, I would
have been very surprised if you were to say you didn't have an opinion, of course.
Yeah, no, trust me, it's not always the case, particularly when things are sticky, particularly in politics. There's, I've been in lots of rooms where there's been sticky stuff to discuss. Yeah. And the ability for people to disappear into the wallpaper in politics, it does happen.
Yes.
I've never been a sort of wallpaper kind of bloke. I tend to take a step forward when things are difficult, rather than a step back.
When the tough gets going, well, I can't remember the analogy, but my dad used to say it: when the going gets tough, the tough gets going. That's the idea. Yes.
Yeah. No, there's a
And
bit
I
of
didn't
that. So
imagine
that would be the full thing that shaped me. I think
lovely,
my,
great
my
answers.
failures.
Wonderful. Sorry, not wonderful that you had failures, but wonderful for that, for the interpretation of the 4 things that have shaped you.
Well, we could talk about that. We could talk about that. I think I don't know if I'd necessarily use the word wonderful, but I'd certainly say that I'd rather have a life with failures than a life without failures. That is for sure. Because if you have a life without failures, what are you going to learn? If it depends what your view of what it's all about, without wishing to
Coming
get
on to
too.
inspirational quotes later on as well. So this is quite interesting.
Yeah,
Also, as you were
philosophy.
speaking, there is a lovely question construct later on about with the gift of hindsight, which I'm fascinated to get to when we get there. Again, there's no agenda in what I'm saying. I'm just really enjoying the curation of this journey in your case as well.
Sure.
So 3 things that inspire you is what we're on to next. If there's any overlap, that's completely fine. But 3 things that inspire you now, Andy Coulson.
Well, there is overlap because my family inspire me, obviously. And I've touched on that already. I think my podcast guests, without wishing to keep going back to the podcast, they really do. They really do. And as I say, I record an episode every couple of weeks. And I get something from every single one of them. I really do, and I'm lucky to have those conversations, and I'm grateful for them. And they're just full of, they're full of gold. And I take things from them and I put it to work. It's just a really useful thing to have in my life.
Sort of
and it's not.
A bi-weekly jolt of perspective, because I know you're 7 series in, so you're doing a lot of conversations in that arena, and the premise is that your guests are often at the brutal, sometimes life-threatening sharp end of crisis, and then fascinatingly often experts who are in the room when crisis strikes, which is a very powerful time to then tap into one's own ability to cope, stay in control, and be resilient.
Yes. Yeah, no, we're very lucky. The vast majority, we've done over 100 of them now, and the vast majority are with people who've experienced crisis. We've had a fair few, as well, as you say, who have sort of managed it, sort of professionals around the edge of crisis. We love it, and I get something from everyone.
Have you been interviewed for your own format yet? People ask.
I did that quite early on. I felt that to continue with it. The podcast was launched in COVID, as so many podcasts were. I started it thinking it would be a limited series. I really enjoyed it. We had some wonderful guests, and then there was an enthusiasm to do more. And in that second series, I was interviewed in the first episode by a friend of mine, Jane Moore. And that was the first time, actually, that I'd really talked about kind of everything that had come to pass. And she was, although she's a good friend of mine, Jane, she's also a brilliant journalist. And she didn't pull her punches, let's put it that way. Yeah. And that's there. That's still available if people want to listen to it. And I talk through, my dramas in some detail.
I have got a sort of show as your QR code moment coming later on. So I promise we're going to point people directly to that. Back into the shaking of the tree. We're still in the inspiring part of your canopy.
Yes. So the other thing I have on my phone is a little sort of pot of gold. So I collect quotes. I collect little bits of inspiration. It might be from a film. It might be from a book. It might be something that I've seen on television. Literally the last piece that I put in, I was watching, I don't know if you've seen it yet, but the documentary on Netflix about Avicii, the Swedish DJ producer who took his own life. It's a fantastic bit of filmmaking. It really is. I have to say, I have never seen a documentary start with the footage of an unborn baby.
Yes.
The scan footage.
Yeah.
With his mum and dad.
Yeah.
And it literally follows this life through to its obviously very sad and very premature end. It's deeply, deeply moving.
And of course, the pulse of the embryo is where the music begins, isn't it? Really, so that's
it's just an astonishing, kind of bit of storytelling, actually, Chris. I'm sure you appreciate it. But the little bit of gold that I took from that, and we've done some interviews on our pod with celebrities. I did an interview not long ago with a singer called Katie Melua, who had an acute psychotic breakdown in her life. Actually, she had an appalling experience, but thankfully came through. And she sat and talked to us about that, and the pressures of fame, and the machine of fame, and and you hear these things and you see these things, and we read about them. I used to report on them, by the way. I've been around that world a fair bit, and I've now had a fair few conversations with people in that world about the need to somehow interrupt this process with the right kind of support and help. And there were interventions with Avicii before he took his own life. And in one of those conversations about one of those interventions, there was somebody says, I think it's one of his friends says, the more you make people happy, and the more you create emotion, which of course is what he did. These thousands upon thousands of people just orchestrating their joy, at a gig. The more difficult it becomes, or the less able you are to manage your own happiness.
Gosh, yeah.
And I thought that was a really interesting way of characterizing the challenge of celebrity. Actually,
yeah. Very astute.
So that's the last little bit of gold that I've popped into my pot.
So what do you call it on your phone?
I've got a very long list.
Is it literally?
It's actually just called gold.
Okay.
And I mean, I've got it's a long list now, I can tell you.
It's called Coulson Gold on your phone. I like that. It was like its own app you can do someday if you want to share the app.
Yeah, maybe. But it's a useful thing, actually. And if I find myself, one of my New Year's resolutions is to put my travel time to better, more productive use.
Yeah.
So this is a really good sort of, every now and then just dip in and spend 20 minutes in it is a good use of travel time if I'm on the tube or something like that.
You can listen to the Good Listening To show as well, of course.
Exactly. Yeah.
Anything else in your goal? The idea of if you find gold, keep digging. So anything else you'd like to whip out of your Coulson Gold?
Well, there's lots of. I can open it up here. There's lots of quotes. There's lots of sort of life advice, if you like, from various books that I've read. Some of which I'm sure you have too. I love the idea, and I use this actually quite a lot in my own head, is that there's nothing more useless than I just want to get this right because it's a Steve Peters quote, but there's nothing more useless than a self-appointed victim. And I think that's a very succinct way of giving yourself a bit of a kick and say, pull yourself together, move on.
Yes.
Steve Peters' book was The Chimp Paradox, which is a cracking book. So I go from something like that to I don't know, Bonnie Raitt, life gets more precious when there's less of it to waste.
When there's less of it to waste. Yes.
Which is from
absolutely.
Which is from Nick of Time, which is a cracking song.
Time waits for no man, all of that.
Time waits for no man, yeah. But life gets more precious when there's less of it to waste. So I go all over the place.
There's Alchemy and Gold coming up, which again resonates with your Coulson Gold. And there's also a moment for the quote of choice coming up as well. So we could be now, if that's the influencing done and dusted, unless I've interrupted you before you did a third one. Are we feeling we've influenced?
No. I think for me it would be family. It would be those guests that I've touched on.
Yeah.
Who also provide the gold, by the way. So there's a there's a link. William Hague quote immediately pops to mind. He was a guest of ours. That everything is life, and if everything in life is doable other than death row, which I think is largely true. Think is largely true, and I think it's a very good line. And then the pop.
Sorry, I interrupted the final moment there. So, and now we're borrowed from the film Up, which is a deliberate construct where I just thought, oh, squirrels, where the dog is going, oh, squirrels. So, as I say, Nigel Bottrell at the Entrepreneurs Convention calls it shiny object syndrome, but I think of it as just being squirrels. So, what are your two monsters of distraction? What are the squirrels that never fail to stop you in your tracks and get your attention, Andy Coulson?
Well, I've got a new one, which I'm undecided about because I've just bought my first Apple Watch. And I bought it because I do have an attention problem, right? So if I'm in a meeting, which I often am, I get pretty absorbed, and I'm not brilliant actually. If I, this is a failure in my operating system. I find it quite difficult to hold what's coming next. And so I decided, well, then I just need a prompt. So I've got one of these things stuck on my wrist. And I have to say, having had it for a few days, I can see the upsides, but I can absolutely see the downsides as well.
Rabbit hole of the meeting sort of searing focus, and then you find it difficult to surface as to
yeah. But I always have found it quite difficult to make sure that I kind of hold and give myself enough time to prepare for what's next. So I sort of bounce along a bit too frequently. I manage it, but I don't want to manage it. I often,
when I'm coaching,
I want it to be more effective.
When I'm coaching, I call that the airlocks in between, how you surface from one rabbit hole and then actually go through a bit of a literal airlock to breathe into the next critical impact opportunity. Go figure.
Yeah, no, exactly. And also, like we all are, a man of a certain age, I'd like to live a little bit longer than perhaps I'm currently on track to do. So getting healthy, that's another reason why I got this thing stuck on my wrist. My wife tells me that it will, that it will help. So
your biorhythms as well as it. And
we'll see where that goes. But certainly this is grabbing my attention.
Okay. Good squirrel.
Number one, which is a bit trivial. And then I think for me, it's, I can give the obvious sort of professional answer that my job is to be on sort of constant high alert for my clients, right? So any communication from a client, I am on it. And if I feel at any point that the business is not reacting in the way that I think it should react, then that is something that I tend to act on, whatever the day of the week, whatever the hour of the day.
So that's giving you a full gathering of squirrels potentially then. So I can't remember what the collective noun for a bunch of squirrels is. A nut, or what would it be? What do you know the answer to that? I don't. I'm just using.
I don't think I do know what the collective.
So your clients are a bunch of squirrels, or a nut, or a collective.
Yeah.
And how many?
But that's a constant thing. But when I think about my, the sort of my dashboard, if you like, if I see anything from the family flashing at all, I'm on it.
Yes, so the family's the ultimate squirrel. We all know that. That's fantastic.
Yeah, exactly.
I'd even interrupt this if my daughter rang. It's a bit like it's hard wiring, and my son. It's hard wiring.
Yeah, exactly.
Children are the squirrels that we all love. So now, a quirky or unusual fact about you now, Andy Coulson, we couldn't possibly know about you until you tell us.
Well, you did say quirky, so which is not especially interesting, but I can turn my ears inside out.
I could do that as a kid, and then I lost that capacity.
Did you?
I used to plug them in and then sit there and then be able to pop them out again, but I can't do it.
Well, I've got earplugs in, so I can't do it.
Oh, go on.
I'll take one out if you like.
You can still do it.
And what I do know is it works much better when your ears are cold.
Yes,
that's another quirky fact about me. I love a cold ear.
Yes. He's done it, ladies and gentlemen. Andy,
if we were together, I'd now ask you to pull my finger, and if you virtually pull my finger, we'll probably know.
Out it came. I didn't pull your finger. That's good. And
there you go. You did say quirky, Chris.
Yes, and thank you for not being so. Normally, when people ask you to pull your finger, in my family, someone farts invariably. So thank you for not doing that. So the ear did pop out at that moment. So that is a great quirky fact. In my circa 250 episodes, nobody's ever done that. Andy Coulson.
Well, there we are.
Okay, and now, well, we've shaken your tree. Hurrah. Let's say that first of all. And now we stay in the clearing, move away from the tree. And as we know, the clearing is the quintessential Coulson hearthrug of your family. Dog, wine, fire, that you are manifesting when you are presumably is it Belmarsh was where the darkest
I was in Belmarsh. I was in Belmarsh for a while, for a couple of months. I was told I'd be there for the weekend, but it turned out to be a couple of months. And then I was shipped off to a prison called Hoseley Bay, which is a resettlement prison in Suffolk.
Sounds more like a sort of seaside resort than Belmarsh, that one.
It does, but it's not.
You need to make light of
although
that.
it was considerably more interesting than Belmarsh, which was a pretty broken system at the time. We were locked up most days, sort of 22 hours, 23 hours sometimes.
Gosh.
Whereas at Hoseley Bay, you were, it was an open prison, so you were able to work and move around the prison, a little bit more freely. And I was put to work there. The governor, when I arrived, pulled me into his office and said, "Right, for as long as you're here, we're gonna put you to work." And so they made me an education orderly, and I was sent off to the education department, and I was there helping kind of get prisoners who'd been in prison for a very, very long time, in some cases sort of 25, 30 years, to prepare for release, which was fascinating work, and to be chatting with someone who was trying to sort of come to terms with, get their head around the idea of reintegrating into society.
Yes,
was truly fascinating. And so I'd help them prepare their CV or start writing job applications. We did some Dragon's Den presentations with them.
Yeah.
A lot of them were pretty entrepreneurial still. It's not work I thought I'd ever do, obviously. But finding myself there, I think I made the most of it, and I think I've contributed the best I could for that period of time that I was there.
Servant leadership, for whom and for what am I in service? And that's quite pioneering of the governor to have thought about that too, because obviously you're accessing your sort of Norman Stanley Fletcher, a more intelligent inmate, if you like, to be able to, whilst you're doing porridge, you'll see where I'm going there, be of service in rehabilitation as well, which is fantastic.
Yeah, and that's it comes back to that productivity point that I mentioned earlier. When I'm at my worst when I can't be productive.
Yes.
All the sort of negative stuff that's there bubbles up for sure when I am much more quickly when I'm not being productive. And so to be able to have gone from two extremes, really, from Belmarsh, where I could do absolutely nothing other than sit on a plastic mattress, reading Dickens, though.
Yes, and again, this is the best of times. This is the worst of times quote from A Tale of Two Cities, right here.
No, I loved. When I first arrived in Belmarsh, there was a book ban for reasons I won't bore you with, but the government had decided. A former colleague of mine, in fact, who was in prisons or Justice Secretary, Chris Grayling, had decided that they would prevent any books being sent into prison. Right. And so my friends were sending books on a sort of daily basis, and I was getting none of them, and I couldn't get to the library either for quite some time because the system was just broken for library visits. And then eventually I did.
Yeah.
I think it was a couple of weeks in, and I maybe a little bit longer, and I just hoovered up as many books as I could, and the biggest books I could find. And I had read it before, but not for many, many years, was the Pickwick Papers.
Yeah.
Not really remembering just what a brilliant book it is. Took that back, and of course the Pickwick Papers has everything. It has newspapers, it has courts, it has politics. The first kind of characterization of a politician kissing a baby on the campaign trail is in the Pickwick Papers.
Wow.
Right, and it's just a brilliant story. It's just a great read. Obviously, Dickens being the storytelling genius of geniuses, and I can't tell you, that just got me through a number of days. I rattled through it, but
yes.
What a release, to kind of disappear into that world.
And if I may say, how interesting it was that when I perceived you, I thought of Dickens. How extraordinary that is, The Tale of Two
Cities.
Yes. Yeah.
No, well, there we are. But yeah, I mean, Pickwick Papers has absolutely everything in it. It's a fantastic piece of work.
So we're still in the clearing. Now we're moving away from the tree. Next, we're going to talk about alchemy and gold. When you're at purpose and in flow, and you've inferred this in any case, but when you're at purpose and in flow, what are you absolutely happiest doing in what you're here to reveal to the world?
Professionally or personally?
This is the story behind the story of being you show, so I don't mind how you answer that.
Well, I'll try and answer from both perspectives, shall I? Because I've kind of given you the answer, I think, on the personal perspective. Yes. I think just to add to that, what am I at my happiest, or when am I at my happiest? And I think it's on holiday with my family. You know, my three sons. My youngest is 15. I've got a 22-year-old and a 24-year-old, all boys, and our older sons. You know, we know that moment's coming when they'll be disappearing off to an extent. Harvey, my eldest, lives away. Monty's still studying. Finn's with us, but the idea that all three of them still, quite enjoy spending time with us, coming on holiday with us, being with us, but we know that the clock is ticking to an extent. Hopefully that will never stop entirely, but it's going to reduce, right? So I grab every one of those opportunities, absolutely squeeze every bit I can out. Yes. And so that's a slight extension on the answer that I've already given you. Yeah. Professionally, it's very simple for me. I love being useful. And the sweet spot for me in this job, as it was in my last job, is when I feel like I'm being useful. Yeah. That I've got something sensible to offer, and as long as it's proved to be useful more than it isn't, i.e., that I'm right more than I'm wrong, then I'm doing my job. And that, particularly when you're dealing with someone who is facing their own difficulty, that is a true professional privilege. And that's why I said earlier, I've never been happier. I've never been happier professionally as well as personally. Yeah. Because when you're in that room with someone and they are putting their trust in you, and they are kind of getting it all out and confronting themselves and what it is they've got to deal with, or their business has got to deal with, to move forward, then that is a very privileged position to find yourself in. And then to feel that you've done something to help them, to really move them along, to either bring them a different sense of perspective, and then set a campaign plan, which is how we work. We're very much kind of, campaign. We take a very much a sort of campaign approach to our work. Yeah. And you see the results of that over the long term. We've got clients here who we've worked with for, a number of years now. That's very, very pleasing.
And are you sitting today in Coulson HQ? Is that where you are?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Just pinning ponytail and a map bit of geography for you there. Okay. And now I'm going to award you with a cake, Andy Coulson. So this is another suffused metaphor with storytelling stuff. Do you like cake, first of all, Andy?
Yes, too much.
And what?
In fact, the office where we're in at the moment, they love a free cake Thursday, which is truly one of the great temptations. And if I happen to be in and around the office at that point, it's not a healthy afternoon.
Lovely. And what's the cake of choice, please? It's a metaphorical cake. If
lemon drizzle.
Oh, lemon drizzle. Thank you. Yeah. And now you get the cherry on your lemon drizzle, which is stuff like now. What's a favourite inspirational quote that's always given you succor and pulled you towards your future?
Well, I've got a few because I collect them, as you know. So we haven't really talked about bitterness, which is an important aspect when you've had difficulty in your life, because the bitterness pit is the thing to avoid, right, at all costs. And I've managed to do that. Like I say, it took me a while to work it out, but I took out a year. But having worked that out, I really I think pretty skilled now, pretty able at avoiding bitterness. And the reason I do that is partly because of this quote, and it's been attributed to a number of people, including Nelson Mandela. But bitterness is like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die. So I think that is absolutely the case. When I've had my bitter days, and I've always felt worse the following day. It's always sent me backwards, not forwards.
It comes at a cost, yes.
Yeah. So that's one. And then I think from an executive that I worked with a number of years ago, who I didn't know very well actually, and who I didn't work very closely with, but it's funny. It's a quote that's really stuck with me. But nothing is as amazing or as devastating as it first appears. And I didn't really know what he meant when he said it.
Yeah,
because I think I was probably in my mid-20s, but it stuck in for some reason, and it's come back and replayed
as a
for me
jolt of perspective.
a
Absolutely.
number of times, because
Yeah.
very little is I think again, without wishing to bang the family drum too loud, other than perhaps the birth of your children, for me, as I said, Eloise, and that question that I asked was amazing, as more amazing than I thought it would be, actually.
Yeah.
Well, just increasingly, but I think it's a truism that not much is as amazing or as devastating, for that matter, as it first appears.
And because I love storytelling structure, you've given us two. I sort of want a third now, so no pressure, but a third quote.
Yeah, I think if you'll allow me, because I've already mentioned it, but I think I would go with Steve Peters. There's nothing more useless than a self-appointed victim, because I think that is, I think that's a rule for me. That's a pretty fixed rule, and is entirely true. It's true strategically, and it's true tactically.
Indeed. Lovely. And now this is a question I'm very intrigued by. With the gift of hindsight, Andy Coulson, what notes, help or advice might you proffer to a younger version of yourself? And you can go wherever you like in your own timeline to answer that. But what advice might you proffer?
I think, receive more than transmit. Enjoy every bit of it. And remember that every day is an integrity test.
And
if I was also, chatting to my younger self, I'd also be saying, listen, you're going to have an amazing life. Right, lucky you. I can look back at my life and think, oh, I wish I'd made more of that. I can obviously look back at my life and think, oh God, if only I'd done things differently or managed differently, or there's all sorts of things that you can say, that I certainly can say about my life, that I can look at through a sort of lens of regret. But I also, I got a lot right as well. I didn't do a bad job for most of my career. Unfortunately, I also did some things pretty badly, and trying to get to a stage in your life where you recognise that that's okay, both of those things, and that's what life is. Very little of life is all up or all down. Nothing is as amazing or as devastating as it first appears. I think that's true. I think that's true over the long term as well.
Yes. It reminds me of the Hamlet quote: "Nothing is either good or bad, but thinking makes it so."
Yeah. Well, I'm not. I'm not a person of faith. I have, obviously in my podcast, I talk to a lot of people where it's their faith actually that's helped them through. I'm not a religious person, but I have come to appreciate sort of Stoics in particular. I'm very interested in all that kind of area and sort of philosophy to an extent. What you find so often is a lot of these quotes do track back to
Marcus Aurelius.
Do track back to Marcus Aurelius and Seneca and others, Epictetus and whatnot. And all of that, of course, what interests me is all of that is just predates, so much of what we now know about Christian faith. So we're going seriously off topic, but anyway, I get drawn to that, as a stage of life that I'm at now, perhaps more than I used to.
Lovely. I was just letting that hang there. I quite like moments of pause within it as well. And now that's a perfect segue into, we're ramping up to Shakespeare in a minute to talk about legacy. But just before we get there, if I may, this is the pass the golden baton moment, please. They don't like it up by Mr. Mannering, but now you've experienced this from within. Who would you most like to pass the golden baton along to? Someone in your network that you know would benefit from, like, or just enjoy being given a damn good listening to in this way, Andy Coulson?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I've had some, if I may, I've had some guests on my podcast who I think absolutely deserve a wider audience and who you might enjoy talking to. I'm going to try and pick one, but what I am going to do, Chris, is email you separately as well and make a couple of suggestions, if I may, because I know I'm only allowed one here.
Well, I've given you the rule of three many times, so please feel free. I'd be honoured if you'd baton past some others as well. That'd be lovely.
Yeah, actually, I mean, I've touched on him earlier. I think Steve Peters, actually, if you don't mind, given that I've quoted him here and taken his line and put it to work, I think I'm going to suggest Steve Peters, who is a very well established public speaker and podcaster himself, and he does not fall into the category of someone who deserves a wider, although he does always deserve a wider audience. He's got a wide audience, but I think Steve would be a terrific guest, and I'd love to listen to it. That's for sure.
Thank you. So your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to furnish me with a warm introduction. Thank you very much indeed. And now, inspired by Shakespeare, and by the way, for your information, this is the actual, well, it's not a first folio, but this is the Shakespeare that I bought myself when I went to the Bristol Old Vic Theatre School circa, it says Chris Grimes, 16986, when I first trained as a actor. How marvellous. But anyway, this is now borrowed from the 7 Ages of Man speech, all the world's a stage with all the bit of women merely players. How, when all is said and done, Andy Coulson, would you most like to be remembered?
I don't know. I think that I'd like to be remembered, full stop. That would be nice. I think that's the first challenge, isn't it? You want that, and hopefully, that's going to be the case with the people that matter most to me. But I don't know that I dealt with what came my way. The ups and downs, without getting too cliched about it. That I dealt with it pretty well, and that I improved myself along the way, which I think is the aim. In life, and that together with Eloise, we've propelled, 3 more human beings into the world, who I am certain will do, a better job than I did, which is also kind of the point, I think.
To play it forward, absolutely.
To play it forward. So yeah, that's sort of good enough for me, I think.
And now, where can we find out all about you, Crisis, What Crisis, Coulson Partners on the interweb? And I'm going to show the audience your QR code, please. So first of all, just point us to, if you're not watching and therefore not able to use the QR code, just talk us through where we can find out Crisis, What Crisis podcast, where
dead easy. I mean, Crisis, What Crisis, just stick it into wherever you get your podcasts, as the saying goes. We're on every platform. We're on YouTube if you want to watch it. I'm very lucky that we record our podcast in the LBC studio, so you can see it all there in its full Technicolor. So on YouTube, stick that into YouTube or into any of the podcast apps that you use, and you'll find it. And the business is the website, coulsonpartners.com. Just stick it in and find us. There you are. You put it up for us. It's very good.
Yes, this is a new section called "Show Me Your QR Code, Please." So yes, if you're watching, that gives you the advantage.
Yeah, it's very good. And we on the podcast front, we put clips out and promote and kind of share interesting bits of gold as we've been discussing on our Instagram as well. So that's easily found. Crisis, What Crisis.
Wonderful. Any other sort of social media handles you want to sort of throw at the audience?
No, just LinkedIn is the other platform that we like. Increasingly, I think LinkedIn is a really interesting place. It's shifting a bit, I think, LinkedIn from its original kind of, I'm delighted to announce that I've landed, a glorious job. It seems to be, I think, a more useful platform now. So we're certainly engaging more with LinkedIn. So you'll find me there, you'll find the business there, and you'll find the podcast there.
Lovely. And I posted about this very episode on my own LinkedIn profile, which is here in my own QR code. Thank you very much. You can actually scan this yourself, Andy, if you want to. I'm kidding.
I think I'm already connected with you.
So here comes a deliberately sort of storytelling, sort of coachy question. Here we go. As this has be helpful if I could actually get the question out. As this has been your moment in the sunshine in the Good Listening To show, Stories of Distinction and Genius, Andy Coulson, is there anything else you'd like to say?
No, I think the only area that does sit at the front of my mind that we haven't discussed is this, this idea of control. And I'm not sure I've used that word much in this conversation. And that's always the thing, whether I'm sat with someone, as a client or as a friend or as a podcast guest. Actually, the word control is often there, and that is for me, with the life that I've led, that's the centerpiece for me, is that I now try and look at situations, good and bad, and work out what I have control of and what I don't have control of. And of course, this is all copyright the Stoics, as we touched on earlier. And that's often, because Stoicism is often characterized as being sort of unemotional, that to be Stoic is sort of stiff upper lip, and that's not what it is at all. At least it isn't for me. What it is to work out what you actually have control of and what you don't have control of. Once you've done that, then you can pour all your emotion, pour as much emotion as you possibly can into the things that you have control of. And I found that to be a very, very useful device, if you want to look at it that way, to kind of manage your way through difficult stuff and to be more productive. That's the sort of centerpiece for me. So no, that's all I would add, Chris. Otherwise, I really enjoyed the conversation.
No,
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for saying yes too. And also, you're pushing on an open door about Stoicism, because my favorite Marcus Aurelius quote is probably very familiar to you, which is appropriate for what we've been talking about: but never let the future disturb you, because you will greet it, if you have to, with the same weapons of reason which today arm you against your present.
Spot on.
Boomtastic.
He knew what he was talking about.
He did. And in fact, I subscribed to the Daily Stoic newsletter during the pandemic.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, well, Ryan Holiday's a star.
And I'm trying to get Billy Oppenheimer, who does the most brilliant newsletter, off the back of he works closely with Ryan Holiday.
Right.
Anyway, la-di-blah. Exciting times. Anything else you'd like to say, Andy Coulson?
No, just thank you for having me.
And if you'll just allow me to do a quick plug for myself at the end, if you'd like to talk about being a guest too, check out the goodlisteningtoshow.com website. As has probably been implicit in what we've been talking about, this is the show in which I invite movers, makers, shakers, mavericks, influencers, and also personal heroes into a clearing or serious happy place of my guests' choosing. It's been a real pleasure and privilege to talk to you, Andy. Thank you very much indeed. And good night. And I'll